Here at RUSI, we speak to around 8,500 students who are in professional military education every year. 18 staff colleges around the world in everything from a single lecture to a 2-week long work package. And on themes as diverse as Great Pack Competition, the future of alliances, or hybrid warfare, active measures, the deep battle, or the reality of contemporary conflict. We have a special relationship with Ecole de Guerre. In Paris, the students don't have a deeply intensive laid out syllabus which they've got to crack through during that year. They do that work before they get to the college. And as a result, the year they spend in Paris, they look at topics which are designed to exercise their intellect, to extend their idea of concepts of doctrine, to change how they think about great problems. We've been privileged over the past 3 years to set them a series of challenges every year, and in conjunction with the English department there, the students spend their year looking at a selection of topics that we give them and deciding to write a dissertation, thesis on one of those topics. The topics we select aren't necessarily those that are around the big issues of the day. They're not even necessarily over the big issues over the next 2 to 3 years. But they are issues and challenges that we think need looking at. They're issues that might extend to 20 or 30 years out. They're conceptual and they're designed to stretch them intellectually, to bring something else to bear as they go into the next parts of their careers. Now, normally, at the culmination of their presentations, at the end of their academic year, the students present their findings and their paper to a panel who then challenge them, question them, and generally dig into some of the detail that sits behind it to really push them and challenge some of the debating skills. And again, they do this in English. What's even better is that we found that we have the support of both Vice Chiefs of Defence Staff from the UK and France who make their way to London to RUSI and join these sessions, each of which has been fascinating, challenging and insightful. This year, of course, that wasn't possible. It wasn't possible for the students to come to London to present or to bring people into a big room to do the challenge sessions. So we did it virtually. And we weren't able to bring a whole variety of others to come and view what they saw. So instead, we did it virtually. And the attached presentations that you can see in the following clips are the findings of the students and their papers. The students are really to be congratulated for what they have delivered. It's quite astounding not only that they've achieved this in a year, but in a second language and delivered a paper as well as a compelling and good presentation at the end of it. The whole range of topics that we gave them for the last year were everything from the reliance on logistics, proxies in space, the morphing of cyber and space challenges, contested theatre entry. But perhaps the two most interesting presentations that you'll see were on, firstly, the concept of parity in military terms, and secondly, the changing rules of warfare and what they mean for the future. The students of both of these presentations really excelled themselves, and we're really grateful to the support from Rob Johnson at CCW and numerous others who helped them through what is a difficult intellectual period for them. We really enjoyed working with them and hope you enjoy the presentations that follow. Thanks very much for watching. The final topic that we gave students from Ecole de Guerre last year was on the changing rules of warfare. The contemporary operating environment for military forces is constantly changing. It's not ubiquitous. Russia, for example, plans on fighting below the threshold of major conventional armed response on land, but challenges in a more orthodox fashion in the air and at sea, judging it cannot win against NATO ashore, but could do so at sea and perhaps, given its air and missile defence capabilities, in the air as well. China, meanwhile, is acting in unconventional means in the China Seas, across the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, with a growing presence in the Antarctic, Atlantic and Arctic. Iran is using proxies locally and is acting unconventionally in the Straits of Hormuz. There are similarities to the North Korean strategy of brinkmanship in more recent IRGC activities. Each of these states is challenging Western preconceptions about what future military conflict will look like. Added to that is the weaponization of space, the normalization of chemical and biological weapon usage, the willingness to use landmine, proxies, terror, and information as tools of war could indicate that the rules of war, as they're understood by the West at least, is changing. Against such a background, there are few signs that the Western military leaders acknowledge that this requires a coherent response, not simply adding a few cyber warriors to force designs. If the rules of warfare are changing, a moot point in itself, is the West ready? From Ecole de Guerre, two military students took up this challenge and formed a team to come up with a presentation that follows. You will guess from the presentation that they were both lawyers. It was a deeply considered and well thought out paper and a good presentation. It culminates all of the presentations and draws them all together into one topic. It's a really worthwhile watch.
Good afternoon, thank you to be here. Last September, RUSI offered us to work on the huge challenges faced by the West in modern conflict. So today, many specialists agree on a major change on the international scene over the past decade. It can be seen a hardening of international relations, and interstate confrontations appear more complex because of growing hybridity in conflict. Confrontations are moving from one space to another, mixing conventional and non-conventional, using innovative technologies that are not or only slightly regulated. Facing these out-of-frame threats, the West seems to be searching in vain for a reading grid and a possible lever of action. Are we ready for such a confrontation? We found it useful to reconsider the ambivalence between power and law. This perennial ambivalence highlights the Western limited room of maneuver.
Are we ready? Well, the West is not ready. We tend to focus on military assets and capabilities, on game-changing technologies, on financial burden issues. All that matters, but the terms of the hybrid confrontation concern first and foremost the very possibility for the West to deploy its power. Facing strategies aimed at acting outside any effective legal framework, a Western response on the same terms as that of our opponents, assumed consent to illegality, unlimited lawfare, unrestricted hybrid operations, and so on, all that leads us into a contradiction trap. There's indeed a strategic asymmetry between the West and its competitors. They don't have to legitimize their action the way we have to. Our legitimacy to act is fundamentally based on the respect for the rule of law. Our narrative is built around justice and the right to intervene. And this asymmetry opens up a great power of coercion for the West competitors. Ultimately, their aim is to reduce the Western camp freedom of action in each theater of confrontation to the sole alternative of inaction or contradiction, and that is the trap. This contradiction is not a pure moral or philosophical controversy. It has an impact on the balance of power and on the battlefield. We must draw new implications today from the Western ambivalence between power and the law to examine how it shapes and how it limits Western military capabilities and propose how the West can best respond instead of sometimes shooting itself in the foot.
So the West is limited, and our readiness depends on our ability to take into account these limitations. Let's go deeper to understand the shape of these limitations. We analyzed following three types of contemporary out-of-frame confrontations from a legal point of view: war beyond the law, war off law, and war below the law. First, beyond the law. This refers to illegality. the illegality of an engagement without a United Nations Security Council resolution, like NATO in Kosovo in 1999, or the multiple cases of violation of international humanitarian law. That could be also the extensive interpretations of United Nations commitments in conflicts like in Libya in 2000 and 2011. Definitely, the West sometimes renounces to legal mechanism of regulation to achieve short-term objectives. And for the West, the consequence of such actions are much more undermining its legitimacy than for its opponents. Furthermore, it gives them ammunition to criticize us afterwards and freeze of our action in the future.
Secondly, through the law. The law has always been at the same time a battlefield, a weapon, and the reason for confrontation. The reality of lawfare today makes it all the more necessary to have the means to identify and counter opposing maneuvers that blatantly manipulate the law. The West must take the strategic use of law into account. However, any legal offensive maneuver by the West, that's to say a Western lawfare, directly exposes us to the trap of contradiction. Western deviation from the law legitimize adversaries' opposing approach and feed the rejection of the international legal order on which Western power is established. And the ability to master normative processes is crucial at a time when competing legal systems are developing. For instance, China Standard 2035, whose ambition is to modify international legal standards. We therefore stress the need for what we could call a limited lawfare, appropriate countermeasures on the defensive side, strategic use of law that doesn't undermine the international legal order on the offensive side.
Thirdly, below the law. Hybrid operations stand for a mix of combined actions conducted in what we call gray zones, in which it is possible to act under the threshold of law. This form of offensive actions are now common use in modern conflicts, and especially among West adversaries. Russians and Chinese have largely developed national doctrines about this type of warfare. Westerners also work on hybridity because we must not leave this area free to our opponents. But taking on hybridity is very sensitive for Western countries because of its outlaw nature, of course, and due to their domestic public opinions that increasingly demand transparency. Therefore, a suitable framework needs to be defined, but so difficult to establish. Finally, despite these limitations, we must find a response to these threats outside the framework, and that is what we will develop now.
So what's the response? To be ready, what must be sought by renouncing both deviating and disconnecting power and law are ways of bringing confrontation back into the field of an operative right. That is to say, on the right on which we can take actions. It is first a matter of adapting the law to the situations that occur in modern conflict. 5 points. 1, we must adapt the international law to the porosity of confrontation types and move beyond the binary option of war or peace legal toolbox. 2, new areas of confrontation, space, cyber, offshore, seabed, etc., are partially or not at all legally covered. Outer space, for instance, is a major international security issue with minimum legal support today. 3, the acceleration of technological innovations reveals many legal vacuums, SALA systems, for instance. 4, we must change a limiting relationship to the law in the military. In confrontation, the law must be seen as an operational legal arsenal from which the strategist can draw, and not only as a limiting framework for the planners, not only as a risk in the event of a trial. And 5, we must strengthen the law against hybridity just to make sure we are not giving legal ammunitions to our opponents.
Okay, so to be ready, we must build a robust right to reduce the out-of-frame field of action of our opponents. But any right defined creates automatically a threshold under which an action is still possible. That is why we must focus on these thresholds over which only it is possible to detect, qualify, attribute, and react to any offensive action. We must lower them, this threshold, as much as possible by developing our ability to answer the question, who does what and to what purpose? That is a question of intelligence and a need of technical superiority. And this superiority cannot be achieved without the unity of the Western camp. That's a moot point. And finally, we must be less readable. We must mask our thresholds and make them hazy to confuse opponents. That means to push them in the same situation as we are today, uncertain about how confrontational situation could develop and raise the level of risk.
Well, to finish our presentation, we need ambition. Ambition for what? For power first. The West European renunciation of power in the name of a peace assured by law is nonsense. Eloquent words of the German foreign minister at Munich Security Conference in 2018. Europeans are the less vegetarians in a world of geopolitical carnivores. Second, for resilience. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted our huge dependence to China and the weakness of our Western international organizations or alliances, EU, NATO, whatever, to find a collective response to what was, in the beginning, a limited sanitarian crisis. We need resilience at national level, European level, NATO level. And multi-domain capability, the West must meet hybridity with a combination of effects. Once you see your thresholds are lowered, and once you are legitimate to act, you have an operative legal arsenal. Of course, multi-domain capability is a core issue. Thank you for your attention.